What you are about to hear is not a dry history lecture. This is a journey into a dark parallel reality, where the most common misconceptions of humanity will be exposed. Prepare yourself to face a question that might send shivers down your spine. Could it be that the bloodiest tragedy of the 20th century was actually the savior of the modern world? Gavrilo Princip was eating a sandwich. That is the rumor that has been whispered across the internet for the past 2 decades. The story goes that on the fateful morning of June 28, 1914, after the assassination plan against Archduke Franz Ferdinand failed miserably, the depressed 19-year-old walked into Moritz Schiller's delicatessen to buy a sandwich. And then, like a sick joke of fate, the Archduke's open-top car accidentally took a wrong turn, stalled, and stopped right in front of the assassin who was busy chewing his lunch. An accidental twist so ridiculous that even Hollywood screenwriters wouldn't dare to write it. But the truth is much darker and more ironic. He wasn't eating a sandwich. Gavrilo Princip was standing there, his hand gripping an FN Model 1910 pistol in his coat pocket, desperate, bitter, and panicked because his Black Hand assassin network had just created a masterpiece of amateurism. The assassination in Sarajevo was an unbelievably absurd chain of errors. 6 assassins were deployed along the Miljacka River. The first, Muhamed Mehmed Basic, completely froze in fear as the car passed by, not daring to pull his bomb. The second, Nedeljko Kabranovic, was braver and threw a grenade, but he forgot the 10-second delay. The bomb bounced off the Archduke's folded car roof and exploded under the vehicle following them. Desperate to avoid being captured alive, Kabranovic swallowed his prepared cyanide pill and threw himself into the river. But tragically, the cyanide was expired, it only caused him to vomit violently. And the river during that dry season was exactly 13 centimeters deep. He lay gasping in the mud, vomiting, before the police dragged him up and beat him to a pulp. History should have stopped at this dark comedy. The Archduke was still alive. The plan had failed. But then, it was Franz Ferdinand's sudden order to change course and visit the wounded soldiers in the hospital, combined with the incompetence of his driver Leopold Lojka, who didn't know the streets of Sarajevo, that caused the car to reverse and deliver itself right into Princip's line of fire. 2 deafening shots rang out. 17 million lives were wiped out. 25 million people were crippled. 1,000-year-old empires crumbled into dust. But let's pause for a moment and pose a blasphemous hypothesis. We always look at World War I as humanity's ultimate stain, a senseless slaughterhouse that devoured a generation of European youth. We always wish that the driver Leopold Lojka hadn't taken that wrong turn that day, or that the car hadn't stalled. But be careful what you wish for. If Franz Ferdinand had survived and returned to Vienna, if the gears of the war machine hadn't been triggered, a far worse reality might have taken shape. Without those 2 gunshots in Sarajevo, the most powerful colonial empires in history would never have been bled dry. Billions of people in Asia and Africa might still be living under the yoke of colonialism well into the 2000s. Women's suffrage, the explosion of modern medicine, national liberation revolutions, all could have been delayed for hundreds of years. Welcome to the world without World War I, a twisted reality where peace is not a gift, but a cruel curse imprisoning humanity in the dark ages of feudalism and imperialism. To accurately sketch out what this world would look like, we cannot rely on wild speculations. This is where we must open the top-secret documents from the Belvedere Workshop, the Archduke's own private strategic advisory body, located at the Belvedere Palace in Vienna. Combined with the counterfactual history research of the world's leading scholars like Christopher Clark with his work, The Sleepwalkers, or Neil Ferguson with The Pity of War, we can reconstruct a logical, cold, and entirely plausible trajectory of a Europe unravaged by war. These historians all agree on one fatal point: the First World War was not an unavoidable destiny. It was the result of terrible decisions, hasty ultimatums, and the bruised egos of monarchs. If Kabranovic's bomb had succeeded in killing the Archduke right from the start, or if driver Lojka had smoothly reversed the car, European diplomats were fully capable of de-escalating the situation just as they had done in countless previous crises in the Balkans. But out of outrage that the heir apparent was gunned down in broad daylight, the Austro-Hungarian Empire decided to send an insulting ultimatum to Serbia, triggering the deadly alliance network already spun across Europe. So, if this singularity had been prevented, how would the world map have transformed under the hands of an archduke hated by his own royal family? Archduke Franz Ferdinand was no saint, and the image of a gentle, pitiful victim is entirely a historical whitewash. In reality, he was an incredibly complex man, hot-tempered, dictatorial, conservative, and deeply loathed by his own uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph. The root cause of this alienation came from something seemingly out of a novel: love. Franz Ferdinand defied all the strictest rules of the Habsburg dynasty to marry Sophie Chotek, a countess without true royal blood. The Austro-Hungarian court humiliated her. The emperor forced Ferdinand to sign an oath renouncing the succession rights for his children, a morganatic marriage, before allowing the wedding to take place. Even in death, the humiliation continued as Sophie's coffin was placed lower than Ferdinand's, and she was denied basic royal honors. But it was this exact ostracism and alienation that forged within Ferdinand a crazy ambition for reform, an ambition that could have saved an empire on the verge of rot. The Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time was a melting pot waiting to explode. It comprised countless different ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croatians, and of course, Serbians. Under the dual monarchy system of the time, the Hungarians shared ruling power, and they were implementing a brutal policy of majorization, trampling on the culture and language of other ethnic minorities, especially the Slavs. Franz Ferdinand hated this policy. Although he himself harbored German supremacist ideologies, his political intellect recognized that, if the oppression continued, the empire would shatter from within. At the Belvedere workshop, he and his advisors mapped out a grand but highly controversial plan based on the ideas of scholar Oral Popoissi, the United States of Greater Austria, USGA. If Ferdinand had taken the throne in 1916 after the aging Emperor Franz Joseph passed away, the European map would have experienced a bloodless political earthquake. The USGA plan would tear apart the ruling power of the Hungarian elite, dividing the massive Austro-Hungarian Empire into 15 autonomous states, based on ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The Czechs would have a Czech state. The Croatians would govern their own land. All citizens, regardless of ethnicity, would have equal rights under a federal government based in Vienna, exactly like the model of the United States of America. This vision was grand, but it was precisely his death sentence. Do you know why radical Serbian nationalists wanted to assassinate a man who wanted to grant autonomy to the Slavs? It sounds contradictory, but it was cold-blooded political calculus. The leaders of the Black Hand were terrified of Ferdinand's reform plans. They knew that if the South Slavs, including Serbs within Austro-Hungarian territory, lived prosperously, equally, and autonomously in a United States of Europe, they would be satisfied. They would no longer want to rebel, no longer want to secede to join a poor, Greater Serbia outside the borders. The Serbian ruling elite didn't assassinate Ferdinand because he was an exploitative dictator, but precisely because he wanted to be a tolerant reformer. His death was a desperate attempt to prevent a peace that could choke the territorial expansion dreams of extreme nationalism. While Austria was drowning in internal schemes, in the east, a true monster was awakening: the Russian Empire. In the modern mind, Tsarist Russia before 1917 is often associated with the image of a backward feudal nation, starving peasants, and a corrupt court manipulated by the mystic Rasputin. That was the cause of the October Revolution. But that is only half the truth. Historical data shows that from 1906 until the outbreak of World War I, Russia was experiencing a miraculous economic boom under the iron hand of Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin. Thanks to drastic land reforms, breaking down the archaic rural commune structure to encourage private ownership among peasants, the Russian economy exploded with an industrial growth rate of 6% per year, a miraculous figure at the time. Russia was not only the world's largest grain exporter, but cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow were rapidly becoming massive industrial hubs. The literacy rate among the urban working class had skyrocketed to 64%. The railway network was expanding at breakneck speed thanks to massive capital inflows from France. It was precisely this tempestuous rise of Russia that became the psychological spark that burned down Germany's confidence. Germany's only military plan to deal with the prospect of being squeezed between France, in the west, and Russia, in the east, was the Schlieffen Plan. The logic of this plan relied on a mathematical arrogance. The Russian army, with its vast territory and poor transportation network, would take at least 6 weeks to mobilize its forces. In those precious 6 weeks, Germany would concentrate all its might to ambush and crush France, and only then casually send troops to the east to deal with the Russian steamroller. The plan was perfect, but it had a deadly expiration date. The German General Staff, led by Helmuth von Moltke, looked at intelligence reports and broke out in a cold sweat. They realized that with the speed of French-funded railway construction, by 1917, the Russian army could pour troops onto the German border within just 2 weeks. The speed advantage of the Schlieffen Plan would be completely erased. German generals constantly urged Emperor Wilhelm II, "If we have to fight Russia, we must fight now. If we wait until 1917, we will be crushed." The what-if hypothesis begins to exert its power at this point. If the Sarajevo event hadn't happened, or had been resolved through diplomacy, the golden opportunity for the German militarists would have slipped away. Entering 1917, Russia's railway network would be complete. A new balance of power would be established. Germany, no matter how powerful, would not be crazy enough to ignite a war they were certain to lose when facing a fully modernized Russia and a heavily armed France. Without war, there would be no collapse of the Russian economy. Millions of peasants and workers would not be thrown into the bloody trenches on the Eastern Front to act as cannon fodder. The extreme dissatisfaction that formed the foundation for the Great Bolshevik Revolution might never have reached a boiling point. Lenin and Trotsky might have forever remained exiled political theorists in Switzerland, writing sharp articles but never having the chance to overthrow the House of Romanov. Instead of becoming the Soviet Union, an unravaged Russia would highly likely have gradually transitioned into a massive constitutional monarchy, a capitalist superpower dominating Eurasia, forever altering the axis of power of the 20th century. We have seen how prosperous the European powers would have been if they had avoided war. But now, let's face the darkest, most controversial aspect of this hypothesis. World War I is often described as a European disaster, but for the rest of the world, it was the first crack in the solid fortress wall of colonialism. The war drained the blood, resources, and money of Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. It shattered the myth of white superiority, when colonial soldiers from Asia and Africa witnessed firsthand their rulers butchering each other savagely in mud-filled trenches. It sowed the first seeds of national liberation ideologies. But if World War I had never happened, and consequently World War II never occurred, the colonial empires would never have weakened. Imagine a mighty British Empire not burdened with massive debt from America. Imagine France retaining its full economic and military vigor. Without the unjust treaties at Versailles, without the rise of nationalist movements taking advantage of the mother country's exhaustion. Asia, Africa, and the Middle East would remain locked in a world divided by European compasses. The exploitation of resources and labor in the colonies would be upgraded with increasingly advanced civilian technologies without facing any resistance strong enough to threaten the core power of the metropoles. The fate of colonized nations would turn down a dark and prolonged path. The brilliant figures of the global national liberation movements might still fight, but they would have to face a colonial machine whose strength remained entirely unchipped. Decolonization, which swept across the globe like a hurricane in the 1950s and 1960s in our timeline, would probably be pushed back decades, even centuries. Nations like India might not have gained independence in 1947. The entire African continent might still be a giant chessboard for European mining corporations well into the late 20th century. Our world would be a more peaceful planet, with fewer great wars slaughtering tens of millions of people, but in return, it would be the peace of a giant prison, where billions of people are born and die as second-class citizens in their own homelands. Would you rather choose a bloody surgery to cut out a tumor, or accept living with a pathogen that slowly drains your life force from one generation to the next? History, cruelly, chose the first path through 2 gunshots in Sarajevo. If there is any region in the world today suffering the most hideous scars from the fallout of World War I, it is the Middle East. We are always taught in textbooks that the Ottoman Empire before 1914 was the sick man of Europe, a rotting, weak, decaying entity, and its death was an inevitable release. But modern historical documents are painting a completely different picture, one that will leave those following the news about Middle Eastern conflict speechless. The Ottoman Empire on the eve of World War I was not waiting to die, they were undergoing a massive surgical transformation. Under the leadership of the Young Turks movement, the empire was making efforts to modernize at an astonishing pace. Power grids were strung across Istanbul, railways connecting the deserts were being established, and most importantly, their political thinkers were hatching a solution that could reshape the entire destiny of the Middle East. Observing the relative success of the dual monarchy model in Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman elite began to seriously discuss a Turco-Arab federation. Accordingly, Turks and Arabs would become equal partners under a common crown. There were even extremely bold proposals to move the capital from Istanbul to Damascus, Syria, or Aleppo to create a more balanced power center for both Islamic worlds. But Gavrilo Princip's bullet shattered that dream. Dragged into World War I on the losing side, the Ottoman Empire was carved up mercilessly. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1916, of Britain and France brought cold rulers and compasses, arbitrarily drawing straight, awkward, and cruel borders across the desert map, completely ignoring religious, ethnic, and cultural boundaries that had existed for thousands of years. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, these nations were created not from the self-determination of the people, but from the geopolitical greed of the victorious powers. So what is the what if here? If Franz Ferdinand had lived, if World War I had been delayed, the Ottoman Empire might have had enough time to complete its transition into a stable multi-ethnic federation. The entire vast Middle East region would be governed by a unified apparatus, instead of being chopped up into hostile, patchwork nations. We might never have witnessed the rise of ISIS, the collapse of Syria, or the bloody, century-long conflict in the Gaza Strip. Names like Lawrence of Arabia would never appear. The Middle East could have risen to become a unified, peaceful, and prosperous energy superpower, holding the economic jugular of the world without needing to shed a single drop of blood for proxy wars. Now, let's step back to look at the macroeconomic picture. Once the political volcanoes were pacified, what would the lives of ordinary people be like? This is where we must face a grim truth: blood is the most powerful fuel to propel the engine of human civilization. The outbreak of World War I was a horrifying nightmare, but it was also the forge that birthed the modern world. Without the survival pressure of a total war, humanity would enter an era of the Great Stagnation. 1. Science and technology fall into hibernation. Without the urgent need to bomb enemies from the air, airplanes would forever remain just dangerous toys, made of wood and canvas for thrill-seeking rich men. The commercial aviation industry might be delayed by decades. Giant, slow Zeppelin airships might have dominated the skies well into the 1950s. Similarly, medicine would take sluggish steps. Reconstructive plastic surgery, mobile blood banks, and especially the invention of the antibiotic penicillin, things born out of the need to save millions of soldiers on the battlefield, would have no catalyst to develop rapidly. We would have a world without trenches, but it would be a world where millions would still die from simple infections. 2. The Cold War of Dreadnoughts. Peace doesn't mean the world would be filled with love. Instead of slaughtering each other with machine guns, Britain and Germany would enter a Cold War half a century earlier than in real history. Instead of a nuclear arms race like the US and Soviet Union later on, the clash of the early 20th century would be a massive naval arms race. Thousands of super battleships, dreadnoughts, would aggressively patrol the oceans. Trade wars, economic embargoes, and covert intelligence operations would create a stifling, paranoid atmosphere engulfing the globe. 3. The ghost that never appeared, and finally, the most profound consequence of the car not stalling in Sarajevo is the deprivation of one specific individual's destiny. In the summer of 1914, in Munich, there was a 25-year-old man, skinny, homeless, making a living by painting postcards. He had no friends, no career, was disowned by his family, and had been rejected by the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna. He was a complete failure. His name was Adolf Hitler. When the shots rang out in Sarajevo, Hitler fell to his knees thanking God because finally, his life had a purpose, to take up arms and fight for Germany. The war molded that failed young man into a monster of extreme politics. Without World War I bringing about the economic collapse and humiliation of Germany, Hitler's hate-filled speeches in beer halls would have just been the ramblings of a madman no one cared to listen to. The Nazi regime would never have been born. The Holocaust, with 6 million Jews slaughtered in gas chambers, would forever remain only a sick sci-fi movie script. No World War II, no atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The history of the 20th century would be wiped clean and rewritten from scratch. History is sometimes as fragile as a strand of hair, decided by tiny and absurdly ridiculous events. A driver taking a wrong turn. A stalled car. A young man standing in the wrong place at the absolute worst time. Exploring the world without World War I is not a mind game to glorify peace. It is a profound wake-up call for us to re-evaluate the world we live in. Every freedom you have, every piece of technology you hold in your hands, the pills that save you when you're sick, and the right to self-determination of independent nations, all are built on a giant monument containing tens of millions of lives lost in the smoke and fire. And that is the cruelest question you have to face today. Close your eyes and make your own decision. If I could hand you a time machine, to go back to the corner of Franz Josef Street in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. You have the right to step up, grab the steering wheel from driver Leopold Lojka, and steer the car to safety. You would save 17 million lives instantly. But in return, you would sentence billions of Asians and Africans to continue as slaves for another century, you would push the progress of medicine and technology back by decades, and you would imprison humanity in an aging, rotting feudal order with no end in sight. Would you steer that car away, or would you stand silently in the crowd, and let the two shots ring out? Leave your choice and your arguments in the comments section below. This is not just a historical puzzle, this is a mirror reflecting how we evaluate the price of progress. I would love to read and discuss with you the craziest perspectives of history. If you love tearing down misconceptions and exploring the wrong turns that changed human destiny, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. In the next video, we will flip the script and ask an even more taboo question: what would happen if the first atomic bomb was not dropped on Japan, but was instead dropped on the capital city of Berlin, Germany? Thank you for bravely journeying to the very end of this dark trip. See you in the upcoming journeys across space and time.